is John 21, verses 1 through 19. Later, Jesus appeared to the disciples beside the Sea of Galilee. This is how it happened. Several of the disciples were there: Simon Peter, Thomas, nicknamed the Twin, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples. Simon Peter said, "I'm going fishing." "Well, we'll come too," they all said. So they went out in the boat, but they caught nothing all night. At dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, but the disciples couldn't see who he was. He called out, "Fellows, have you caught any fish?" "No," they replied. Then he said, "Throw out your net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you'll get some." So they did, and they couldn't haul in the net because there was so many fish in it. Then the disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his tunic, for he had stripped for work, jumped into the water, and headed to shore. The others stayed with the boat and pulled the load net to the shore, for they were only about 100 yards from shore. When they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them: fish cooking over a charcoal fire and some bread. "Bring some of the fish you just caught," Jesus said. So Simon Peter went aboard and dragged the net to the shore. There were 153 large fish, and yet the net had not torn. "Now come and have some breakfast," Jesus said. None of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Then Jesus served them the bread and the fish. This was the third time Jesus had appeared to his disciples since he had been raised from the dead. After breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," Peter replied. "You know I love you. Then feed my lambs," Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," Peter said. "You know I love you." "Then take care of my sheep," Jesus said. A third time he asked, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Then feed my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself and went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and others will dress you and take you where you don't want to go." Jesus said this to let him know by what kind of death he would glorify God. Then Jesus told him, "Follow me." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, choir. Didn't they do a great job? Let's give them a hand again. I walked in this morning, and you just don't know what Jill has to put up with every week. There was one person, and I won't name him, Mr. DiCarlo, that was just complaining about his part. My goodness. I'm glad I don't have to deal with you. So, but they did a great job, even despite the complaining. Simon Peter is out on his boat fishing along with the other disciples. He's brooding. He's thinking deep thoughts, not quite sure what to make of all that's happened. And then he has a flashback. He recalls some years earlier how he left his fishing nets at the seashore to become a follower of Jesus, and how Jesus liked him. Jesus included him. And Jesus changed his name from Simon to Peter, meaning the rock, because Jesus felt Simon was strong, he was stable, and he was solid like a rock. But then all of a sudden, things turned sour. Jesus was arrested, and Peter the rock became scared. And on that fateful night, he denied knowing his Lord 3 times. The next day, Good Friday, Jesus was nailed to a cross, and Peter was devastated. He was shattered and defeated and brokenhearted. But then came Easter, and Peter was at one and the same time thrilled beyond belief. He was excited and gratified over Christ's resurrection, but he was confused and perplexed about his own future. Peter then returns to Galilee with his friends. Several days pass and nothing happens. And this is where today's scripture from John 21 picks up. Peter and his friends have been waiting there in Galilee for some time, just waiting for some direction from God. Nothing happens. Finally, in typical fashion, Peter becomes impatient. He can't take this waiting anymore, so he says, I'm going fishing. It's like Peter saying, I just can't handle this any longer. The waiting's driving me crazy. I'm worn out with all the indecision, the waiting, the risk involved. I'm just going to go back to the familiarity and the security of what I know, my old life of being a fisherman. The others go along with him. They fish all night, but with no luck. And then as dawn breaks, they see someone standing on the seashore. It's the risen Lord, but they don't recognize him at this point. He tells them to cast their nets on the right side of the boat. And they do, and they have a huge catch of fish, 153 large fish. And John then turns to Peter and says, it's the Lord. Peter impulsively dives in and he swims to shore. And the others come following along in the boat, dragging all the load of fish. As they come ashore, they see the risen Christ cooking breakfast for them on a charcoal fire. And after he serves them, he takes Peter off to the side, and 3 times he asks Peter the same question. Simon, do you love me? Peter responds, yes, Lord, you know I love you. Peter says, then feed my sheep. And this story ends exactly as it started 3 years before, when Jesus called Peter to be his disciple, saying at the seashore these words, follow me. There's a very real human quality to this story this morning. This morning, I'd like for us to look at this story using 3 basic questions. First, what do we see here physically? In verse 11, Peter got back in the boat and he dragged the net to shore. In it were 153 large fish, but the net still did not rip. So what's the significance of the 153 fish? Some early church fathers have shared their ideas about what the 153 might mean. Cyril of Alexandria in the 5th century said 100 represents the fullness of the Gentiles. 50 symbolized the remnant of Israel. And 3, of course, represented the Trinity. The great theologian Augustine, he had a little more complicated view. He said there are 10 commandments. There are 7's the perfect number of grace, and that totals up to 17. And if you add all the numbers between 1 and 17, 1 plus 2 plus 3, on up to 17, you get 153. Not only that, if you were to arrange them all in a row, 17 on the top row, then 16 all the way down to a row of 1, you get a perfect triangle. and there's the Trinity. Jerome, another 5th century theologian, suggested there were 153 different types of fish in the sea, and it was symbolic of the church reaching all the people of the world. But could it be that they mentioned 153 fish because that's how many there were in the net? Let's say you're in the business of fishing, and you live in 1st century Palestine, and you've hauled a huge load of fish to shore, and you've dumped them on the shore. In the morning, you're going to take them to the market to sell them. What's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to count them, that's right. Especially if it's such a great catch, and they see there's 153. That's a tremendous business day. What else, other than the number of fish, do we see physically in this story? The disciples are fishing, and this probably represents their temptation to give up, to go back to their old way of life, to just throw in the towel. There's always that temptation for us. When things get hard, when time gets tough, we're tempted to give up, to backslide, to go back to our old lifestyle. Another thing we see in this story is the breakfast. Why does John give all the details of the breakfast? The major reason of this part of the story is to underscore the reality of the resurrection. The resurrection wasn't a vision. It was not a dream. It was not a hallucination or a hoax. It was not the figment of someone's imagination. It was not the appearance of a ghost. The risen Christ has defeated death, and he's out there on the seashore cooking breakfast for his friends, and he's eating with them. Ghosts don't eat. That's why there's all the details. It's Jesus in his earthly resurrected body eating with his friends. What we see here physically documents the reality of the resurrection. And that brings us to our second question. What do we see here emotionally? This is a story that's full of emotions, of fear, of guilt, of remorse, excitement, of self-doubt, and bewilderment. Peter is facing all of these and many more things. He's at a crossroads, raising the same questions that we should be dealing with. How do we respond to Easter? Imagine what might be racing through Peter's head. Jesus has yet to have a heart-to-heart talk with him about his 3 denials on that Maundy Thursday, or the day before his death. They are sitting down to a meal once again. And the last time they had a meal together, it was Passover. Peter had told Jesus, "Lord, I will never betray you. I will lay down my life for you." Peter is facing the most crucial decision of his life. What will it be? Will I serve Christ, or will I forget about him? Will I take up the torch of his ministry? Will I go on with it, knowing the great risks that are involved, knowing that I have already failed miserably once? I denied knowing Jesus 3 times. What if I do it again? Maybe I'm just a coward at heart. Maybe I should just go back to my old secure life on the fishing boat. How can he ever forgive me? How could he ever trust me again? I bragged and I boasted about my strength and my commitment. I talked big, but then when the crisis came, I denied him. I let him down. That's what Peter may have been feeling that day, and that might have been why he was so quick to jump out of the boat and into the water and swim to the shore. Peter was always impulsive, but there's more to it here. It's Peter's way of saying, "Lord, I'm sorry I failed you. I want to be the first to the shore, the first into your presence, because I'm so sorry I failed you." Jesus was so perceptive. He knew what was going on in Peter. Just as he gave Thomas, who doubted, what he needed of letting him feel the scars in his hands, or his scars physically, and that helped Thomas to believe, he now reached out to Peter in an emotional way, giving him the help and the healing that he needs. He takes Peter aside and says, "Simon, do you love me?" And Peter replies, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." "Then feed my sheep," Jesus says. He does this 3 times. "Simon, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." "Then feed my sheep." 3 times he does it. Why 3 times? To let Peter's 3-fold affirmation of his love and devotion wipe out that bitter memory he had of his 3-fold denial back on that Passover night. Jesus said to Peter, "I believe you. You are still the rock. You can do it. You have to put your failure behind you. You are forgiven. The slate is wiped clean. You can start over again. And that's precisely what the risen Christ does for each of us. He knows our failures. He knows our fears, but he still loves us. He still believes in us and comes to us with healing and forgiveness. In today's story, we see physically the reality of the resurrection. Emotionally, we see the beauty of God's amazing grace. So the third question is, what do we see here about theologically, or about our Christian faith? For one thing, we've already seen that this story is about forgiveness. Can't you hear Peter saying to Thomas something like, Thomas, you and I are both slow believers. I know you struggle with thoughts where you needed proof, and Thomas, like you, I have seen enough. I didn't feel his scars, but he touched mine and offered me healing. My heart cries out with you, my Lord and my God. This story is about forgiveness. It's about resurrection. Christ conquers death, but he also resurrects us. He gives us a new life. The good news of Easter, that's the good news of Easter. And this story is also about love, God's love for us. His gracious, sacrificial love for us expressed so magnificently in the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Jesus says to Peter, if you love me, feed my sheep. The point is, the best way to love Christ is to love his sheep. He doesn't want our burnt offerings. He doesn't want our sacrifices. Jesus wants our love. Love is the significant or the authentic sign of discipleship. Love for others is a symbol of our love for Christ. He wants us to follow him and to imitate his loving ways. He wants us to understand the love that love is the most powerful thing in the world. Jesus wants us to know that love makes all the difference. We demonstrate our love for Jesus as we love other people, that both those who are easy to love and those who are very difficult to love. That's our commission. That's the charge that's been given to us. That's the call that we have, to feed and love Jesus' sheep. A lot has happened in this simple story of Jesus just having breakfast with his disciples. The disciples were still overwhelmed with emotion and confusion regarding all of the events in the last weeks. Jesus' unusual teachings at their last Passover meal together, his arrest, his crucifixion, the tomb being found empty, and then his post-death resurrection appearances to them. The disciples might have been fishing because they were questioning their call as Jesus' disciples now that he was gone. They have no leader, so where do they go from here? And this is the third appearance of Jesus to the disciples. We don't know the impact this encounter with Jesus had on all the disciples, but we do know it had a profound effect on Peter. We don't know all the details around the breakfast that morning, but we do know something took place that caused them to know without a doubt they were eating with Jesus, their Messiah. We all know we're all going through different experiences in our lives, and we're in need of God's touch in some kind of way. What I might need may not be what you need. Some of us may be going nonstop. You may be on the verge of burnout. Some of you may be going through more than your share of trials. Some of you may feel you failed Jesus so much that you can no longer do any good for him. Maybe it's been a while since you felt any excitement or joy in your relationship with Christ, and you're just going through the motions. You no longer feel God's presence is close to you. Or maybe you've lost your focus in what God's purpose is for you, and you just feel like you're wandering aimlessly. Maybe you've been struggling through life under your own power, and you realize life is too hard to control. And you've recognized you need to give that control to God. No matter what you're going through, God has a gift he wants to give you. And I don't know what that gift is, but God does. I pray you will be open, that you will be receptive to whatever God wants to work in your life. I pray that you would take time to sit with God, to listen to him. Let him speak to you. Let God minister to you, to work healing in you, the healing that you need, so that when Jesus asked, "Do you love me?" you can pray, and I pray that you can respond as Peter did. Lord, you know I love you. So, and when Jesus says, feed my sheep, then I pray that you will be prepared to show your love for him as you love those that God has placed in your path. Amen. As we prepare to receive the sacrament of Holy Communion,